Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll be reading through the second lesson from the book in Aqeedah, and then we'll be heading through inshallah Tuhfa. So lesson number 2 is entitled Importance of Tawheed, and the author mentions فإذا عرفت أن الله خلقك لعبادته فاعلم أن العبادة لا تسمى عبادة إلا مع التوحيد، كما أن الصلاة لا تسمى صلاة إلا مع الطهارة. فإذا عرفت أن الله خلقك لعبادته فاعلم أن العبادة لا تسمى عبادة إلا مع التوحيد، كما أن الصلاة لا تسمى صلاة إلا مع الطهارة. Translation says here, so when you come to know that Allah created you for His worship, then know that worship is not considered or is not accepted as worship except when done with Tawheed. Just like salah, prayer, is not considered salah or is not accepted as salah except when done with tahara. So just like the previous lesson, we're going to mention 4 bullet points inshallah that come under the text. So the text is in Arabic, the part which says فَإِذَا عَرَفْتَ أَنَّ اللَّهَ خَلَقَكَ لِعِبَادَتِهِ فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ الْعِبَادَةَ لَا تُسَمَّى عِبَادَةً إِلَّا مَعَ التَّوْحِيدِ، كَمَا أَنَّ الصَّلَاةَ لَا تُسَمَّى صَلَاةً إِلَّا مَعَ الطَّهَارَةِ. So the first bullet point, or the first footnote, is where the author says فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ الْعِبَادَةَ. So at the start it says فَإِذَا عَرَفْتَ أَنَّ اللَّهَ خَلَقَكَ لِعِبَادَتِهِ فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ الْعِبَادَةَ. Then know that worship, here first footnote, and it's the same footnote as was the last footnote in lesson 1, which was, what was the footnote in lesson 1, the last one? You have to remember, you have to memorize. I'm not asking you to look in your book, you have to know from memory, even if you don't memorize word for word, but you know the meaning or the gist of it. That worship is not, worship is a comprehensive name. It's a comprehensive name for anything that Allah loves and is pleased with, from the actions and statements of the servant, hidden or apparent. Worship is a comprehensive name or a term which covers all that Allah loves and is pleased with, from the statements and actions of the servant, whether they are hidden or apparent. So here in the text, when the author says فَإِذَا عَرَفْتَ أَنَّ اللَّهَ خَلَقَكَ لِعِبَادَتِهِ فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ الْعِبَادَةَ. Then know that worship. Okay, what is worship? Someone asks you, what is worship? You say worship is a comprehensive term. The word worship is a comprehensive term, yeah? That covers what? No, but just in the gist. That covers So is a comprehensive term that covers all that Allah loves from the actions and the statements, hidden or apparent. Even if you don't memorize this word for word, especially in English, you don't need to memorize things word for word. Okay? Arabic, if you get to the definition in Arabic, you can do so, but it's not necessary at this level. But you should know the gist. It is, when we say ibadah, which can translate it as worship. What is worship in Islam? It's not just salah. It's not just fasting. These are from the greatest acts of worship, but they themselves are not the whole of worship. So worship, we said, is a word that is a comprehensive term. Comprehensive means that it covers many things. It's one word, but it can cover many things, okay? It's a comprehensive term that covers all that Allah loves and is pleased with from the actions of the servant, or the actions and statements of the servant, whether they be hidden or apparent. Whether those actions be hidden or apparent. So can you give an action that is hidden, that is in worship? Sabr, because you're refraining, no one can see that you're having sabr. Like fasting, for example, is a hidden act of worship, because no one can see that you're fasting. Okay, what about an apparent act of worship? An act of worship which you can see? Salah is an act of worship that can be seen. What else? Another act of worship that can be seen? Charity. When you give charity, you do zakat, you give it to somebody. Even though you can hide it from people, but generally speaking, it's act of worship that can be seen. Hidden or apparent is statements, acts of worship which are statements. For example, the azkar. Okay. The second bullet point is where the author says is not considered worship. La tusamma ibadatan, is not named worship. It is not classified as worship. And here the bullet point is that every act of worship has at least two conditions. Every act of worship has at least two conditions. For the act of worship to be accepted. For that act of worship to be accepted. The first of these two is, number one, ikhlas. Ikhlas. Sincerity. Number one, ikhlas. Ikhlas. Sincerity. And that is that the act of worship is done for the sake of Allah alone with no partner. And that is that the act of worship is done for the sake of Allah alone with no partner. This is also sometimes referred to as an intention. Meaning, when we say intention, it means a sincere intention, not just an intention. Intention, niyyah. And that is that a person intends with his act or her act Allah alone. He removes anything other than Allah out of his or her heart for that action. So the first one we said is what? Ikhlas, sincerity. And the second condition for any act of worship to be accepted is ittiba'. Ittiba'. Try to write in Arabic if you can, from what you can hear. Ittiba'. If you can't, then you write it in English. Ittiba' means that the person. Ittiba' means following, okay? But what it means for us here is that the person follows the way of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in performing that act of worship. That the act is done in accordance to the way the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught us. So any act of worship then has at least two conditions. Number one, ikhlas, and number two, ittiba', follow. And there are many evidences for these two conditions. From them, I'll mention one ayah. The last ayah of Surah Al-Kahf, Surah 18. The last ayah is ayah 110, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions part of the ayah, فَمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُو لِقَاءَ رَبِّهِ فَلْيَعْمَلْ عَمَلًا صَالِحًا وَلَا يُشْرِكْ بِعِبَادَةِ رَبِّهِ أَحَدًا. فَلْيَعْمَلْ عَمَلًا صَالِحًا وَلَا يُشْرِكْ بِعِبَادَةِ رَبِّهِ أَحَدًا. The translation of that part can be, so whoever is hoping for a meeting with his Lord, then he is to do righteous deeds and not ascribe in worship with his Lord anyone, and not ascribe anyone in worship with his Lord. Ayah 110 of Surah 18. Write the reference and then you write it out when you go home, inshallah. Here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned two things. فَلْيَعْمَلْ عَمَلًا صَالِحًا. Let him do, the person has to do righteous deeds, i.e. not just any action, but a righteous action. How do we know what a righteous action or a good action is? By following the way of the Prophet ﷺ. He taught us what is a good action. Likewise, Allah says, وَلَا يُشْرِكْ بِعِبَادَةِ رَبِّهِ أَحَدًا, and that he is not to put any partners in the worship of his Lord. So that's the second of the two that I mentioned in the ayah, and that is ikhlas. So if a person does an act of worship, i.e. an action that he is seeking closeness with, a religious action, but he does it for other than Allah, then the act of worship is not considered worship. Allah will not accept it as worship. Likewise, if a person does an act of worship and he does it for Allah, but he does it in a way which is not taught to us by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then that will not be considered an act of worship. So someone wants to pray dhuhr, but he prays it for other than Allah. He prays it for other than Allah, then the salah will not be valid. He has to pray again. Or if a person wants to pray dhuhr, but he says he's going to pray 5 rak'at instead of 4, will that dhuhr be accepted? No. Why? What's missing? Or what is the issue from these two conditions? He didn't do it in the way the Prophet ﷺ taught us, because he taught us 4 rak'at. Pay attention to it. Third footnote is where the author says, فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ الْعِبَادَةَ لَا تُسَمَّى عِبَادَةً إِلَّا مَعَ التَّوْحِيدِ. The word Tawheed. Footnote number 3. Tawheed. Tawheed is to single out Allah. Tawheed is to single out Allah with all that is specific to Him. With regards to His Lordship, Tawheed is to single out Allah with all that is specific to Him. With regards to His worship, His lordship, with regards to His lordship, His worship, and His names and attributes. Tawheed is to single out Allah with all that is specific to Him with regards to His lordship, His worship, and His names and attributes. In other words, it is to give the rights of Allah to Allah alone. To give the rights of Allah to Allah alone. The rights of Allah are many. We're going to come across, we're going to discuss some of them later on. But they are the distinct things that are for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Tawheed is to make sure that a person gives them only to Allah. التوحيد هو إفراد الله بما يختص به من ربوبيته وألوهيته وأسمائه وصفاته. Last point. The author says كما أن الصلاة لا تسمى صلاة إلا مع الطهارة. Just like prayer is not considered prayer, or is not named, or is not counted as prayer except with tahara. So here where it says number 4, tahara, where it says in the text tahara, the last word, put number 4, and this is footnote number 4. Here everyone agrees that salah is not accepted, is not valid without tahara, purification. If somebody is able to purify themselves and they stand up to pray dhuhr and pray dhuhr but they don't have wudu, Khatib, what's the ruling on his salah? So what does he have to do? And then does he have to do it again or not? Good. So the person who prays without wudu and he is in a state of hadath, impurity, ritual impurity, and he prays without wudu, he does all the salah from the first takbir. Stephen, listen, from the first takbir, you don't need to write this part, from the first takbir he reads Fatiha, he does everything that he needs to do in salah, but he didn't have wudu, and then he finishes the salah. Is his salah considered salah? Is it going to be accepted as salah? No, even though he done everything. Okay, so here the author is giving us this example that all the Muslims agree upon, to show us what? To show us a greater point, and that is that just like the salah, even though the person done all the actions, just like the salah is still not accepted from Allah, because the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, إن الله لا يقبل صلاة أحدكم إذا أحدث حتى يتوضأ, that verily Allah does not, وكما قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, verily Allah does not accept the salah of anyone from you if he does impurity until he makes wudu, even if he prays, does everything. Okay, so just like we all agree as Muslims that even though the person done the actions, done it nicely, is still not accepted because he missed the condition, then likewise if a person prays, fasts, does everything, all types of worship, but he does not single out Allah, he gives the rights of Allah, one or more, to other than Allah, then that worship is not accepted. Okay, so this example, the footnote number 4 now, the example here, the author gives us an example with tahara, which we all agree upon. I'll give you an example that will make it easier for you to see, inshallah. What was the Prophet ﷺ's father's name? Only one person knows? Abdullah. What does Abdullah mean? Servant of Allah, worshipper of Allah. So before the Prophet ﷺ was a prophet, a messenger, did the Arabs know Allah? Well, if his father was called Abdullah, then he must have known Allah, isn't it? Okay. How did they know Allah? Which previous prophet? Yes. So Ibrahim and Ismail, they knew Ibrahim and Ismail, yeah? Because Ibrahim brought Ismail to the area when he was a baby and the well of Zamzam came. There's a story about it, okay? Anyway, to make it long story short, they knew the Prophet, they knew Allah, but they associated partners with him. They associated partners with him, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they said that we have these idols are righteous, some of them are righteous people that passed away, whatever the case is. We're going to ask them and we're going to sacrifice animals to them so they can help us to get closer to Allah. Okay? But Allah in the Quran explained that even though they worshipped Allah, they also worshipped idols. So although they worshipped Allah, they said to the Prophet Muhammad when he came as a prophet, he said, okay, 1 year we're going to worship Allah alone. And the other year you're going to tell the people also to worship the idols. They wanted to make a compromise. But even though they worshipped Allah, this worship of Allah was not accepted by Allah. What did Allah say in Surah Al-Kafirun? قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ لَا أَعْبُدُ مَا تَعْبُدُونَ وَلَا. So Allah told the Prophet ﷺ to say, "O you disbelievers, although they worshipped Allah, the kuffar, the Quraysh, they worshipped Allah, but they had idols with Allah. You understand? They gave some of the rights of Allah to the idols, to the righteous people, to stones and so forth. Allah told the Prophet to say, "O you who disbelieve, لا أعبد ما تعبد, I don't worship what you worship, and ولا أنتم, and you do not worship what I worship." But did they worship Allah? Yes. When he looked, they worshipped Allah. Did the Prophet worship Allah? Yes. So they are worshipping what Allah worshipped, but it's not considered worship. It's not accepted as worship. Allah did not accept it as worship. Clear? So here what the author is telling us is this: if you don't single out, if you don't worship Allah alone, then you're committing shirk, and your worship is not accepted. Understood? So if a person worships Allah alone and does it in the way that the Prophet ﷺ taught, is that considered worship? Yes. What if a person worships Allah in the way that the Prophet ﷺ taught, and then after he finishes salah, for example, he goes and worships an idol, or gives an act of worship to an idol? Is that considered worship? The first part? No. Okay? And we're going to come in lesson number, which lesson talks about the consequences of shirk? Lesson number 4. Okay. So those are the 4 footnotes for lesson number 2. You need to remember them in meaning. You don't have to memorize word for word, but you need to remember the meaning. And if there's an ayah, like we mentioned today, then you should try to remember the ayah. Okay, who can remind us of lesson 1?